lecture tonight as part of the 20th Annual HOPES Conference. As most of you know, the HOPES Conference is a student-run conference, and it is run through the Ecological Design Center. Tonight we have our very own Brook Muller here. He's also the Associate Dean for the Academic Affairs in the Architecture and Allied Arts. Along with teaching courses in design studio and architectural theory and urban ecology, he also is the director for the graduate certificate program in urban ecology, ecological design, and is extra free time. He also published a book this year, came out in February, and it analyzes the structure and function in ecology in systems and how that bridges the way we design towards architecture. So that is what we tonight, and we'll also have a reception afterwards. So hope you can also join us. All welcome.
So Cassia told me to bellow out. Is this okay? Can you hear me?
No one talks.
Okay. And so the bad news is the book is out, but it hasn't arrived. It's really frustrating because I was hoping to make a killing on you all. But I'm happy to offer a sneak preview, and I think it'll be very evident over the course of this talk what an enormous influence the HOPES Conference has had on my own thinking, and so it seems like a very fitting occasion to talk about some of the ideas that influence the book. Before I begin, I want to express my indebtedness to many people. This is an incredible intellectual community at this university. My colleagues in the Department of Architecture and the School of Architecture and Allied Arts, I would say the landscape architecture faculty, have had a huge influence on this project. Karin Knudsen is here, a former student, a practitioner in town. We co-authored a paper together that is really very much makes its way into this book. Leonard Huey, another student of mine, we've co-authored papers together, who's off on his own teaching career trajectory right now. Howard Davis and Peter Keyes, we co-teach the Architectural Context, Place, and Culture course. I'm especially indebted to Josh Serra, who is a professor of landscape architecture at Cornell. We've taught a lot of studios together, and I really so much appreciate the way he's so nimbly able to bridge the natural sciences and design. Of course, I would like to say thanks to Kathy Corlett, my wife, who knows very well the way in which landscape architecture and architecture are magical forms of the ecological arts. And I should mention I dedicated the book to our son, Calder Eames Corlett Muller. May he grow up in a global city of natural plenty. But I really dedicate this talk to the students of the Ecological Design Center for all they have done for this school. This is an incredible event. I think more than anything, it's influenced my thinking. I think it's going to be very obvious as I go through the kinds of influences the HOPES Conference has had. I think it really bodes well. The design professions are undergoing radical transformations. Higher education is undergoing radical transformations, and I really think that what the EDC does is really hopeful in terms of how we engage these issues. The master-apprentice model gives way to the allied arts model, where we're all facilitators, we're all collaborators, we're all listeners. And I think I'm going to show several images of student work throughout this project. That will become very obvious, and that's another, perhaps the greatest influence of all. So you'll see the student projects, you'll be able to recognize them because they're the ones that are polished and precise, and mine are the ones that are rough and freehand, okay? So I'm going to begin with some quotes, and then I'm going to interweave some passages and drawings from the book. The premise of the book is as follows. By focusing design expression on natural systems processes augmented by the human hand, through timely engagement of ecological methods, models, and metaphors, architects, through their collaborative efforts, can expand ideas of the performance of the city. A deeply ecological architectural intervention is one that creates more diverse urban habitat frameworks, filters and cleanses stormwater in order to improve biological conditions in compromised waterways, fortifies the connective ecological tissue of neighborhoods and regions, and in other ways supports broader regenerative landscape processes. To engage these possibilities is to excite the architectural imaginary, invite heightened aesthetic speculation, and accept a higher level of unpredictability. And the latter point gets a fair amount of attention in the book. Because ecology is a natural science, one would think it would lend greater certitude to how we approach the creation of the built environment. And in many ways it does. And yet one critical question that ecological engagement opens up is how we deal with uncertainty. This is especially so in an era of climate change. And so we are caught in a bind of the need to act with urgency with a somewhat limited idea of what it is exactly we are dealing with. So a passage from the book. Enhanced ecological literacy pertains not only to nature's rules, but additionally how levels of complexity exceeding the most dependable indicators and rule-governed modeling tools alter what is meant by soundness in the assimilation of knowledge. Renewing commitments amidst the proliferation of non-knowledge encourages expanding frames of reference, deploying multiple frames as a means to register other kinds of difference, and owning up to the limitations of any one conceptual composite. And so my concern in this book with language and the terms that architects employ, this is a quote by Mark Johnson that appears in the back cover of the book. He is a professor of philosophy here at the University of Oregon. If language is a set of choices intended to produce effects, what meanings have been given to green architecture, and what effects do these meanings have on design inquiry? My concern is to open up the domain of green or sustainable architecture beyond matters of building performance, incredibly important matters in their own right, so we connect more seamlessly with domains such as landscape architecture, restoration ecology, urban ecology, and landscape ecology. Thus, the focus on language centers on metaphorical constructs that designers use. Coyne, Snodgrass, and Martin argue the greatest privileging occurs when certain metaphors are so taken for granted that they're generally not seen as metaphors. Similarly, Iris Marion Young brings awareness to the ideological function of metaphors when they represent the context in which they arise as natural or necessary. The landscape architect Walter Hood, who lectured here at HOPES 2 years ago, asked that we remain quiet for a while at the beginning of the design process, that we should not be so quick to naming things so that new ways of thinking about the problem may emerge. So this is a project that Walter Hood did. This is an African-American low-income community in South Carolina that has been occupied since the emancipation. There's this low-density suburban sprawl that's encroaching on this. They're trying to preserve some aspects of their community, and he felt that it was inappropriate to describe this as a master plan. He ended up calling it a life-ways plan, that the patterns of living that were what made this community should emerge out of this, and as opposed to a more of a top-down approach. And so we just did a parking garage studio this winter, but if you call it a parking garage, you've already lost. It's already this dark, damp, inhumane environment. And so we found ourselves thinking about other ways of talking about what this kind of structure could be. Political ecologist James Evans points out a contradiction, that we expect denser cities at the same time we expect them to perform in a more sustainable way. And in some ways this isn't a contradiction. Denser settlements are more energy efficient naturally as compared to low-density sprawl. But in some ways, the challenges are greatly exacerbated. We think about challenges related to clean air and clean water and habitat quality and the urban heat island effect and so on and so forth. And this is where design comes in, as the landscape architect Randolph Hester in his book Design for Ecological Democracy so convincingly argues that that's the inherent nature of the designer, is to identify contradictions, actually seek them, and try to synthesize them and resolve them. So we must conceive of the city as a locus of ecological possibility. There are many reasons for this. I'm not going to go into detail, but we could speak, for example, of species area curves and the encroachment of human-dominated landscapes on all parts of the land and what this suggests as far as extinction rates. Or we could think of the fact that cities were often built in places of high biological productivity. Or we could look at the long-term ecological research findings that suggest that there are more species occupying urban environments than we ever imagined. And so if we design urban environments differently, we could make it that much more possible to harbor non-human species. The city is an ecosystem like a grassland or a forest, but a city is unlike a grassland or a forest in that we could design it to be a little bit more like a grassland or forest if we wanted to. So we can use the adaptive capacity of the city to its fullest advantage. Mark Johnson, in landscape architecture here, suggests that we are only now developing frameworks to harness hard urban systems, the very systems seen as primary contributors to ecological degradation, as one locus for habitat regeneration. There are many, many facets to this harnessing, one of which pertains to the need to create greater spatial heterogeneity in urban environments. For example, the making of a more sinuous path from the roof to the river so as to slow down stormwater flows and so as to put it to work. Or by providing more diverse habitat structures and pathways. So although this passage pertains to the deceleration of stormwater as design opportunity, it also corresponds to a broader range of ecological considerations. Reassessment of the value of underutilized space and the desirability of prolonged transference prompt metaphorical constructs emphasizing surface tension, hovering over and passing through, the staggering of eddies and incorporation of relief valves, variegation, scored, raked, and modeled surfaces, increase in roughness coefficient, and offsets in the X, Y, and Z. A challenge becomes that of achieving inefficient efficiencies, where certain elements retain compact shapeliness, formal simplicity, and high surface-to-volume ratios, the thermal envelopes of buildings, for example, while associated features gain in morphological complexity in support of habitat function, and where advantage is sought in the interstices. We're going to find out that 2007 was an absolutely epic year of HOPES, because a lot of these slides are from authors of books who appeared in that year. Joan Iverson Nassauer, the landscape architect, argues that we have to focus on the aggregate of innumerable decisions on private land holdings, that the Jeffersonian small-scale lot is our inheritance for better or worse. People manage those sites, their buildings, their landscapes for reasons other than habitat value, but perhaps with the kind of incentives we could think of them as aggregating and contributing to a greater system. We are really lucky in Oregon to have such a progressive planning body as Portland Metro, the only elected regional government in the United States. And their Nature and Neighborhoods program mapped habitat conservation areas throughout the Portland metropolitan region lands that are privately owned, which have significant habitat value, that if they're maintained, preserved, or improved, could greatly enhance the publicly held lands that operate as the backbone of functioning ecologies in the metropolitan region. And so they provided incentives for developers and landowners to think about developing. If there's an urban growth boundary, there is likely to be a lot of infill development. That's probably preferred to expanding the urban growth boundary. Maybe we shouldn't be building on places with high habitat conservation value, but it is probably going to happen. So are there ways that it could happen in not only to not create harm, but actually improve the biological baseline of these sites? We are not recreating nature. We are talking about human-dominated landscapes and what landscape architects call the creation of novel landscapes. So we can't reestablish ecosystems in all their complexity, but we can reintroduce or encourage certain functions. An important and difficult question becomes which ones. Are there umbrella functions, for example, that help set other processes in motion? I would agree completely with planners and landscape architects that if we don't make decisions thoughtfully at the landscape, region, metropolitan, or neighborhood scale, there's not much I would be able to do as an architectural designer working at the site scale. But that happens to be the scale at which I've operated in professional practice. And I've been really interested in asking how individual sites, individual projects on individual sites, what roles can they play relative to a larger urban ecosystem? And that role will vary depending on the location of the project and its use and so many other things. We're actually starting to see through initiatives like the eco-districts, we're starting to begin to see the implementation of some models where we can begin to see a financial benefit to collaborating at these neighborhood scales. My site is low and wet and it's great for collecting water, and yours is high and dry and it's great for collecting sun, and is there a way that we could partner so that we can avoid this sort of Grizzly Adams loner sustainability approach to zero energy buildings, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me given the fact that we're in an urban environment where we can pool resources. That's the very advantage of being in a city. So although site-scale interventions provide the focus of the book, urban ecological design as functional and spatial collapsing must occur at multiple scales. Public transit corridors with properly configured rights-of-ways can double as corridors that facilitate wildlife crossings. Urban alleyways can be sites for transmission of water, power, cyclists, social ferment, native birds and pollinators. Buildings can frame and furnish niches and other habitat structures for a variety of species. Ecological design is informed, resourcefully minded, radically intensified placemaking for a multiplicity of lifestyles and life histories. When possible, we could think that the social diagram and the spatial diagram can overlap. So these are a couple images from the Great Central Valley competition that I did with Blackbird Architects many years ago. And there are these alleyways, which are where we are handling stormwater, that lead out to these tule lakes, which are these recreational amenities, but they're also habitat features. We're trying to recall an earlier history of the southern part of the Central Valley where you would have these seasonal tule lakes. So could we align the social diagram and the ecological diagram so places where people gather are also where these functions occur? And the question is, how can we make that happen at a much denser scale than that previous project, because that's what we're looking at now. This is a project by student Sam Russick, and it's wonderful where the water gathers. There's a unit, another unit. The water gathers. There's a cistern. That's where the stairway between units are. So where the people collect is where the water collects, and then the next realm out is the alley space, which is where the water goes. And eventually the water makes its way, cleansed, cooled, and oxygenated to the Willamette River. And again, the social diagram and the ecological diagram coincide. If disturbances can be positive, making sequestered resources available to an ecosystem, might we think of architectures as instigating disturbance regimes and recognize more specifically ways development alters flows, hydrological flows, energy flows, nutrient flows? We are not just talking about introducing bioswales on a site. In increasingly dense contexts, we are engaging in systemic morphological alterations, combinations of landscapes and buildings that, with heightened intentionality, help establish better functioning ecologies. Shed roofs are a part of the watershed. And so again, these are sort of Oregon density projects, and I would really strongly encourage you to attend Juan Yu's lecture on Saturday at 2 p.m. as part of the HOPES conference. She's a professor of architecture at the University of Hong Kong, and she's been doing these similar kinds of studios that I have, these urban ecology studios. But her studios are necessarily on steroids because of the context in which she operates. It's crazy. So Hong Kong is in the Pearl Delta region. The Pearl Delta region is the same size as the Willamette Valley. The Willamette Valley has 2.7 million people. The Pearl Delta region has 127 million people. Again, I would encourage you to attend on Saturday and see where certain parts of the world are headed and how they're trying to deal with these enormous, enormous challenges. The notion of gap dynamics that apply to forest ecosystems could perhaps be deployed in an urban context where we reopen the tarmac and where demolition and excavation with ecological intent is a fundamental part of bringing machines in to build buildings. This is a project from 2 years ago by Kristen Kelsey, where the wetland harvesting machine, where spatial quality, site experience, environmental education, and the creation of an architectural framework are coincident with regenerative processes. So you can tell I've embarked on a set of more metaphorical speculations for making ecologically attuned urban architectures. Another wonderful quote from Bart Johnson in the Department of Landscape Architecture. The scaffold is a wonderful metaphorical structure that allows for new forms to be created, but does not determine those forms completely. Here's a scaffold project by Blackbird Architects in Santa Barbara. This is an office building for the Air Pollution Control District of Santa Barbara County. Very inexpensive building, a box. That was what they could afford. It's a simple box. It's actually a very lovely light-filled box. Boxes can be just great. And then independent of that is this freestanding trellis structure. There are telephone poles and canvas shade cloths. And this is right after construction, so the vines have subsequently taken over. And as the vines take over, the shade cloth deteriorates and you still have shade. So this provides shade. It also pre-treats the air before it enters into the office building. It offers some habitat value. It's also the 101 heading south, kind of approaches it and then turns again in an S-turn. So this green wall is the billboard for the Air Pollution Control District of Santa Barbara County, which I think is wonderful. So the symbolism and the human function and the ecological function are aligned. Architectural elements can cohere as a datum frame or series of planes that, through their stable configuration, elevate awareness of both the cyclical temporality and sudden emergence of ecological happenings. Conversely, landscape ecological features might frame the theater of life taking place within human-focused interior. Architectural framing devices can increase the didactic value and experimental potential of an urban landscape. A bracketed device encourages measurement and counting, analysis of effects of orientation, changes of occupation and intensity, attractiveness of features to colonization, etc. A frame space is a real-time, life-size, three-dimensional graph facilitating plotting and comparison. So we could look at an incredibly wonderful project like Bruno Town's Horseshoe high-density housing project in Berlin, which is basically a frame within a frame within a frame. And you can start to imagine that the things that we create as necessary for us to dwell and live and work could be flipped and thought of as opportunities for experimentation with urban ecological systems. Just want to point out, this is a very inexpensive project. Here's the frame for this occupant, this apartment dweller, and then the brick is in the surround, the very thing that calls attention to the individual, and the very thing that you come into contact with is given this specific and special material treatment. I think it's really quite beautiful. Or perhaps we can make use of an entire city grid for the purposes of experimentation. The urban grid is a matrix of endless extension of economic opportunity. In many ways, the great neutralizer of otherness could provide the framework for ecologically inclusive, spatially heterogeneous systems. To butterfly or pixelate the block is a means to preserve the grid's lineaments while establishing new grounds and testing of bands to facilitate gap formation and other processes of diversification and reclamation. Superimposition of new layers, stormwater alleys, and pollinator corridors, inspired by and that fortify biological and hydrological processes, augment the functional capacity of the inherited order of streets. The latter preserve block-like formality, while inner courts perform a different, more fluid manner of work and assume less fixed identities in the process. These new layers create openings that might positively establish more airy, animated block interiors and buildings that in turn benefit from the presence of life. I'm talking largely about landscape architecture now, but what I'm really interested in is a fusion. Rather than the customarily high level of resolution of a building and a ghosting of the landscape in an architectural proposition, or rendering of the landscape around the white blank box building as placeholder in a landscape architectural investigation, stitching of relationships motivates design inquiry. There's a whole section of in the book on bodies, the metaphor of the body, which has incredibly detailed and long history in architecture, the building as a body, and I trace it very, very lightly. One instance of this corresponding to this image, and it's actually an idea that Ted Toadvine shared with me here in the front row, thinking about Viennese bodies, turn of the century, so a project like the Zuckerl House by Plessig. Freud's illuminations on the unconscious parallel Viennese secessionist architects' interest in the design of facades for multi-story buildings as cloak-like skins intimating mysteriously complex interiors, the preserves of domestic arrangements that are in turn the inhibiting shelters of personal drive. Later, and I'm going through this very quickly, in the 20s and the decades that followed, advancements in understanding the genetics of organisms decenters the language of the body such that the human figure no longer occupies a privileged location. And indeed today, design culture embraces an esteemed language of animal architecture, rather through systems thinking and cybernetics, bio-eco terms such as adaptability, resilience, cellular, generative, emergent, and symbiotic influence architectural design explorations, in particular those driven digitally. Small-scale biological phenomena such as genetic switches, the channeling and selective inhibition of information flows, and other processes determining the growth of the organism inspire a new design generation interested in rule-governed architectural morphology. A body once again projects upon a building surface, but it is a different body requiring higher levels of magnification. While there is much to be said for conceptualizing buildings as organisms, this manner of thought has tended to produce relatively limited insular experiments focusing on the scaling up of smaller biological phenomena in order to design individual works of architecture or significant components of them. In this body-to-building mapping, architects borrow biological and ecological terms in ways that may not significantly impact the ecological function. This is from the Association of Computer Aided Design of Architecture. I think incredible work. So this is intended as a criticism. This is representative of the way that we're thinking about biology and ecology and architecture today. We're sort of scaling up this phenomenon again. And I'm just concerned that why can't we engage these issues in ways that could have some significant bearing on non-human life forms? Josh and I are working on a paper right after the book came out called Adaptive Architectures, and we came upon this on Google, so it's interesting. And I'll talk a little bit about how we're thinking about adaptive architecture momentarily. So I go on to describe an alternative orientation, one that is actively relational, focused less exclusively on internal biological circuitry and more on the melodic exchange at the porous boundaries of beings and environments. As is the case with the IBM, this is a project, as many of you know, that I worked on for 4 years with Danish and partner in Stuttgart, where we had this notion of the building as an organism, that the garden structure would be this relatively fixed armature, this repeating structure between which we said the building grows between the gardens. And that if the building needed to grow over time, the landscape structure anticipated how that growth might take place. We had this idea that these greenhouse roofs spanning between office wings would be the lungs for the project, and that the atria gardens that were created would be the heart of the project. And that it was a double skin glazed system. We just took one of the pieces of glass and put it up on the roof. And so what that meant was this piece of glass, this facade could be much more porous. So we talked about the porous skins of the building. And I recognize the danger of singling out any one aspect of the design process, which is incredibly complex. In this case, I single out conceptual intent described metaphorically. And I also describe how projects like this build from multiple metaphorical influences. Important is the fact that the IBM project team entertained multiple metaphors. Project as garden and project as city as examples, in addition to organism. Rich architectures, the effectiveness of translation from conception to drawing to building, require free commerce of plural images, buildings as organisms and landscapes, bodies within gardens and buildings, cities as systems of ecologies. Scenes of scalar and combinatory thinking encourage creation of diverse spatiothermal gradients generated from highly economical material assemblages. Entailments derived from several source domains cast simple sets of architectural features in complex parts. So this little section builds from the paper that Karin and I co-authored, where we discussed the proliferation of landscape-derived metaphors in contemporary architectural practice. And this has been another, there's a whole history of using the landscape as a metaphorical inspiration for making architecture. But there happens to be greater attention to this as a source for making architecture today. And in the paper that we wrote, we made a distinction between what we call emulative uses of the landscape, where the building is inspired by certain, the building design itself is inspired by certain aspects of the landscape. It could be formal aspects, it could be performance-based aspects. This is what biomimicry is, right? We design human-made artifacts based on inspiration from nature. Or the Acadia example of adaptive architects discussed previously. So we have the emulative, and then there's also this interactive approach where we think about understanding habitat types in the natural landscape and how the building could be a support mechanism for these habitat types. So it's more of an interactive way. The building isn't nature, the building is providing support for these processes. And this was a really incredible Master of Landscape Architecture thesis by Shannon McGinley from 2008, where she really explored how this would work. Even to the point where living roofs would be subject to disturbance regimes. Maybe you mow the buildings, but there's actually a building in Ottawa that they burn the roof twice a year. Architecture must burn. And then the hero for me with this 2007 epic HOPES year is Paul Kephart, who speaks of his projects as works of eco-sabotage when the architects he works with are indifferent to his ecological preoccupations. There's a great story that he told when he lectured that he was working on a green roof in Seattle, and architects say he would like to have the roof blossom white to recall the time when the seabirds flocked to the site. And he said, or we could create the conditions for the seabirds to return to the site. And so he's doing these vast, so he's got a design studio and a nursery. He's thinking about living roofs as nurseries for endangered wildflowers and grasses. An amazing thing. And he gets involved in Renzo Piano's California Academy of Sciences project, where they had this emulative notion that these undulating living roofs would mimic the Golden Gate Hills in the backdrop. And here's an ecologist designer looking at these roofs and looking at the fact that there's slope and there's shade and there's sun and there's relative moisture and relative dryness, and he has this opportunity to create much more diverse conditions than what is ordinarily possible on a green roof. Or the Transbay Terminal under construction, and I just think this is the way that I would really strongly encourage architects to think. This is the Transbay Terminal where you have BART lines and the bus lines intersecting, and you continually have to supply fresh air to the underground because people need constant supply of fresh air if they're underground. And you have to eject moist, stale air. And we think that the job of our architect and working with the mechanical engineers to bring in the fresh air, and whatever happens to the stale air, it's really not my problem. Well, he said moist air, we could start to use that to create estuarine ecosystems on the roof, which could support all kinds of endangered plants. I think it's a beautiful way to think about how works of architecture can become components of viable urban ecology, life-enhancing and resourcefully abundant systems embedded in and interacting with others of greater magnitude. And so this notion really inspired the adaptive architectures paper that Josh and I wrote, and which in turn was the inspiration for the studio project that I'm about to talk about. Could works of architecture, could buildings be cue to changes in the environment and adapt their behavior in response to those changes is really the question. And then could they communicate with other buildings to also adapt similarly? And so we decided to look at wetlands, which have been really very much compromised in urban environments, wetlands adjacent to rivers, and we decided to look at the parking garage as the problem child of the urban environment and see if we could flip it so that a parking garage or a parking marsh could behave more constructively. And so the idea is, in the early history of the parking garage, it would be a full-service gig, and you would pay to get your car, to park your car, and you get an oil change, and you get a car wash. And so the thought with this project is you gather all the water from the roofs, you gather the water from the adjacent Ross Island Bridge for many of the student projects in the studio. You gather water from neighboring sites. You use that water to clean the car, which is, as many of you know, this horrible problem relative to urban waterways, copper, motor oil, heavy metals, just incredibly problematic. So you take that water out of the hydrological system, you give the cars a bath, you clean that water, and then you give that water back to the wetlands when the wetlands needed the water the most, when you needed to establish the proper hydrolimit depending on the species that you would be planning for. About a month and a half ago, Leo Yui got an email from a woman who works at the West Eugene Wetlands, and she said, because last spring was so dry, and this spring is so dry, we're really losing our macroinvertebrate populations living in the wetlands. And this is a huge problem because this is a very important part of the food chain for birds here, for fish in this site in the South Waterfront in Portland. And so with what we're going to experience with climate change is these more severe storm events in drier springs and summers in all likelihood. So could we use the built environment as a way to meter out the flows in ways that would be supportive of these systems? So we're on the South Waterfront site. It's contaminated soils. That's where they want to develop. The soils have been capped by this geotextile mat. Our ecologist Mark Wilson, working with us, says that's a perfect sub-base for wetlands. So we're going to construct wetlands atop contaminated soils with a protective layer between adjacent to the river, and it's a gravel deposition part of the Willamette where salmon will stop if they can find food on their way up or down the Willamette River. So there were 6 amazing projects. I unfortunately only have images for 3 right now, but all 6 deserve some airtime. Here's a project where you have a mechanical lift, you park the car, you wash the car, you use the water to grow algae, you use the algae to make biofuel, you use the algae to clean the water, and then you give the water over to the wetlands and to the river. Or a project where, this is what the site used to look like. They built ships here during World War II, cobalt, PCBs, you name it, it's been capped. They're going to put cars in the mechanical lift. They're going to have mushroom gardens below, collect water from the bridge adjacent, let it filter through, have the mushrooms mediate the soils, and then let it go to the river. So the question is, how can a motorcycle be a part of the hydrological cycle? What's the challenge of the studio? Or this scheme where they're actually looking at just these, almost like a prosthetic device that you can attach not just to this building, to the system of elements that you could attach to any parking garage or any number of buildings in the urban environment that again could filter out pollutants. And it becomes a circulation spine where you gather water, and treat it as where you gather people and life and life. And we just found out Monday that this team, Carolyn, Samuel, and Cody, were named a finalist for the Royal Society of Art Student Design Award for 2014. Congratulations. urbanism metaphor has supplanted the machine metaphor. So Le Corbusier, 1924, architecture is a machine for living in, probably the most influential sentence in architecture in the 20th century. And with initiatives like the Living Building Challenge, we see that the organism metaphor has arrived. And yet, what I end up advocating for in the book is a hybridization of metaphors. Certainly, there is a measure of rightness to a machine-like characterization of architecture, given the manner in which architectures are produced, the efficiencies and levels of performance expected, and the technologies projects consist of and house. Of interest are the entailments ordinarily associated with the machine metaphor and how the conceptual system alters when coupled with ideas of architecture of the landscape. Architecture will always be projections of bodies, concentrators and extensions of landscapes, and types of machines. An appropriately non-modern notion of the architectural machine would be that of prosthetic components, coordinated arrays of devices positioned within larger eco-social technical assemblages in the service of life. This would appear to be at the heart of Smoot Allen's augmented landscapes project or the work of Danish and Partners, where a conscious arranging of stock, machined parts is not an aesthetic end, it is instead an enabler of expressive events, as when the hand and the handrail couple. So many of you have seen this studio project from the Rome Summer Studio that Kathy and I taught in 2009, but it's a wonderful example of an architectural intervention as a eco-architectural prosthetic device. So the water entering into Rome is one of the cleanest in the world. New York, Eugene, and Rome. We have the cleanest water in the world. And when it goes out to the Tiber, it's a horrible mess. And so could we start to think about these things? You actually walk down and greet the cleansed water, move up a stairwell between these sand containers that are filtering stormwater from roofs. You get up to the rooftop, you see the aqueduct in the distance, you see where the source of water comes from, and then you make your way down through these biotrays that are filtering the gray water from the apartments and back out. And so it's something that operates at the immediate tactile scale, the cool of this system, the plaza scale, the urban scale, and then it's connected to this regional hydrological system. Or we could look at the case projects. Anna Dyson spoke at HOPES in 2010, where they really are these living walls that are cleaning water and shading light, really thinking about living systems coupled with these machine-like systems to make more efficient, more beautiful urban environments. David Leatherbarrow, HOPES 2007, talks about architecture as being constituted as three horizons. These projects, this project and this project, I think it asks that we reevaluate David Leatherbarrow's three horizons as he describes them in his book Uncommon Ground. As Leatherbarrow describes it, we begin to see that this corporeal schema is enmeshed within an expanding range of distances, a structured topography that includes where I am, which is to say, where the things I now need are within reach, a middle distance, and an expansion toward the clear blue horizon, an equipmental, practical, and environmental horizon. Not one of these can be separated from the others, hence the lateral spread of the ensemble that integrates these rings into one field, terrain, or topography. The dining room, the street, the town or landscape, differentiated but reciprocating. And while he speaks of their inseparability, the way that he describes them and the way I have drawn them leaves one feeling that they are quite separate, that they reciprocate at a place or mood. What I think Case is doing what Smoot Allen does in the Grand Egyptian Museum competition, is reconstituting horizons altogether. The middle ground, where the practical horizon drops away, the equipmental is deployed outwardly, the topographic is immediate, the equipmental is continuous with the practical and the topographic. With the introduction of a ribbon of water from the distant horizon to the graphic field of the project site, the museum becomes a water-cooled thermal regulatory device, a condenser, distributor, mister, and microclimatic phase changer. Arrays of ecological equipment wash over point, line, and plane. And as I alluded to earlier, this collapsing of horizons, this move toward the heart of an ecological architectural urbanism requires all of the arts of the designer in collaboration with others. An ecologically based architectural design calls for it and facilitates qualities of magical realism, or what the post-humanities scholar Carrie Wolf describes as irrealism. Arts that inhere in ecological architectural design are directed toward the promise of grounding the fantastical in the terrain that we occupy. The gardens of Villa d'Este and Tivoli are an astonishing example of the finite turned infinite, an elaboration of aqueous reality as designed exuberance, transference and shifting of states as commentary on continuity. The gardens honor the many presences of water, acknowledging while making light of the rules governing it, musing on the forces of gravity, and drawing people to its many features in ways that cause wonderment and thermal delight. Today, a more consciously artistic and democratic ecological approach to design might employ frivolity as a strategy of efficiency and celebrate the scenography of a multitude of beings in everyday urban environments. There is theatrical potential to the ecological design of the city, a staging of nature, heightening perception of unending sequences of props that exist beside and beyond the spectacle at hand. Ecologically architectural graphics script the performance of an urban nature. And so what I am trying to say, despite the incredible challenges that we face, is what an incredible opportunity lies before us. So in conclusion, architectures of inventive adaptation in the service of life follow precisely from dialogue who speak the world by opening to it. Ecologists, landscape architects, artists, environmental historians, philosophers, historic preservationists, others. Outward to the unfamiliar leads to the generation of new metaphorical scaffolds. Collaborative narrative building and shaping the ecological potential of architecture is instantiated through inventive, concerned description of the kind of the world, fragile, powerful, efficiently abundant, fantastically earthbound. One sees value in shaping. The urban environments designers create bear enormously on the devotions and attentions felt toward those who dwell there. The ability of non-human species to flourish and the dexterity and kindling of our imaginary. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brooke. We would like to celebrate his newly published book by Paul Williams of the Heart. Nude, ecological, your age book.